Welcome to the Beer Frontier. My name is Gage.
And I'm Robert, and as ever, we're here for the beer. Today, we're going to be looking at Bock.
We'll go and see what Ben, the home brewer's up to.
We have two local Bocks to try.
We'll go and see Enzo and see what he's cooking.
And we have a German Bock to taste.
And we'll go out on the road and visit a microbrewery.
So Gage, I think a lot of our viewers wouldn't be that familiar with Bock.
Oh, okay, Robert. A Bock is a dark German lager, and the style originally developed in the 14th century in Christian medieval monasteries in Germany as a celebration beer for religious festivals like Christmas. It wouldn't have been a true lager as we know now because lagers weren't developed by then. So a Bock is a dark beer, and it's got almost no hop aromas on the nose, very little hop bitterness and very little hop flavour. So it's a complex malts-driven beer, which is normally quite high in alcohol, but the alcohol should be smooth, certainly not grating in any way in your mouth. So sometimes these beers have quite low carbonation, which is a bit of a surprise to some people. So they're not fizzy, they're not explosive like some beers. And so we're really looking for a dark, complex, rich lager. Within the Bock family, there's 4 different styles, and a bit confusing, the Australian Bock from Thornbury is labelled as Bock. The New Zealand one, and we were pretending we invaded New Zealand last Thursday at 3 o'clock and we've annexed New Zealand, that's labelled a Doppelbock, and like the German one is also labelled a Doppelbock. So Double. But a bit depends on the interpretation of the style by the brewer, so it doesn't quite flow on as you might expect it to.
Okay, but nonetheless, a very nice winter drink. And I believe you have a beer in your bonnet again this week too, don't you, Gage?
Oh, I do, Robert, and it is taxation. It is how unfair the tax system is for small-scale brewing in Australia. Spirits and beer are taxed on their alcohol content. Wine is taxed on its selling price, and this is why there's so much cheap wine in wine casks, which is the really big problem with abuse of alcohol. It's not beer, cheap wine's the problem. So because the taxation system is unfair, it's really a disincentive to small-scale brewing. And I can tell you how bad it really is that a small-scale brewer pays 25% of their revenue in tax, that's that one tax in excise, to the tax office, but they have to pay it before they sell their beer. So if you start a small-scale brewery in Cooey-Rupp or wherever, and you're chugging along doing one batch a week, and if you can't keep up with demand, if you have to do a second batch in 1 week, you have to save up to pay the tax office in advance. So what we're really asking for is a fair go for microbreweries, a fair go for craft brewing.
Okay, so is there a campaign?
Oh, absolutely. It's been going for quite a while, but if you log on to our website, thebeerfrontier.com.au, you can follow the links. And actually, we might set as homework. All 56,000 of you. By next Saturday, I'd like you to log on and follow the links and try and convince the federal government to change this very unfair taxation system.
Yes, well, I'll certainly be doing that. But now, let's go and see what Ben, the home brewer, is up to.
Hi guys, and welcome back. This week I will be taking you through the basics of fermentation. So let's have a bit of a look, shall we? Okay, so we've got the beer that we had last week. This is pretty much set off on its journey and ready to go. If you remember last week, we oxygenated the wort. The reason for that is that yeast itself has 2 inherent life cycles. There's the aerobic one where it likes oxygen, and there's the anaerobic one where it doesn't like oxygen. Inherently it has to go through the first cycle in order to multiply and grow, so it can't do that without the aid of oxygen. So as you saw, I had the pond pump. We oxygenated that wort as best as possible. Without doing that, we won't give the yeast the best chance it has of multiplying to the largest colony that it can be. Once it's achieved that state, then it moves into its anaerobic state, which is when it starts to make beer. So what's actually happening? Well, it's taking all of the sugars that are inside our lovely wort, and it's breaking them down from more complex sugars into very simple sugars, such as glucose. It then gets ingested into the yeast cells, and then those yeast cells will make byproducts, the byproducts being carbon dioxide and alcohol. So that's what we want to make our beer. So there are two different types of beer basically. There's lager and there's ale. Well, that's the way we perceive it at any rate. As far as the yeast are concerned, it's essentially the same thing. The reason why we treat them differently is because they're done at different temperatures. In this case, I've made an ale and my temperature is going to be about 18 degrees. Now I want to maintain that for around 4 days while the fermentation takes place. If I was making a lager, I'd probably want to be doing it about 5 degrees, and that would probably take anywhere between 1 and about 2 weeks. So in the case of this, it's winter in Melbourne, so I want to be using one of these little babies. This is my patented heating pad. Essentially, it's insulation for the beer, so normally I'd wrap that round fully, do that up nicely. The idea is to maintain the temperature. If I need to, I can just turn it on low and just make sure that temperature remains the same for the entire ferment. So it's as simple as that. How do I know when it's finished? Well, I need to use Mr. Hydrometer again, give myself a reading, and then do exactly the same thing again 24 hours later. If the two readings are the same, I know all the sugars have been eaten, my fermentation's finished, it's time to rack and then lager. All right, so basically, before that's actually finished fermenting, so a couple of days into it, if you wanted to add some additional sugars, such as honeys or candy sugars or anything like that, then would be the time while the yeast is at its most active. Once it's finished, however, you've got the decision. We're going to lager the beer either way. Lagering means that we're going to have to chill the beer down. But before we do that, we can rack or not rack. It's a choice that we have. It's really up to you. Basically, it means putting it through into another fermenter. We put a tube on here, send it through, the idea being that we rack it off of the yeast that's sitting at the bottom. In a commercial brewery, you take the yeast off of the beer, so that's effectively what we're doing. It gives the beer a chance to get off of the yeast and stop taking on the flavours of the dead yeast, and also mix up the beer and make sure there's any final fermentation happening by getting the sugars and yeast up and going again. In order to do that though, you do need to use our friend CO2, Mr. Carbon Dioxide over here. Without carbon dioxide, what you've effectively done is you've lost your carbon dioxide head that was on our original beer, and by putting it in here, we now have an oxygen head. So if you're going to rack through into another fresh vessel, you need to make sure that you purge that with some CO2 first to ensure that we don't get staling of our beer by it coming into contact with oxygen. Your beer never wants to see oxygen again from this point on. So whether we've got it into our new racked fermenter or this one, quite simply now we need to move into lagering, as I said before. Now the process of lagering has nothing to do with lager or ale yeasts. All beer needs to be lagered. So by lagering, we simply mean chilling down. It's done its fermentation. It's now a turbid beer. We basically want to clear that beer out and finish a few chemical processes in there. This just takes time and low temperatures. So we essentially set our fridge to the max, shut the beer up, and then that's going to sit in there for, look, it's different every time, but between 1 and 2 weeks minimum. And then it depends on the beer style and your taste as to when you want to do something else with that beer. So next week, basically, I will take you into where we go from there and how we can keg our beer and or bottle it in that case. So we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Welcome back to the keg room, and now it's time to try our local bocks. And we have 3 Ravens Bock from Thornbury, the Ravenator, and apparently it's traditional to name Bock beers with an ator ending, so we've got the Ravenator. And from New Zealand we've got the Harrington's Doppelbock.
Two quite different styles of breweries here. 3 Ravens was started in 2003 when the directors, the owners of an engineering firm in Thornbury and their staff used to drink at a pub on a Friday night because they had a good range of beers. The pub changed concept, as they do. So the engineers, being engineers, said, oh, we've got room in our basement, why don't we build a brewery down there? So they did. And the brewery has actually gone from strength to strength, and they produce a range of beers. Their main ones, they're white and they're blonde, and some seasonal beers and some specialities. And I think this is one of their speciality beers. So that's their story. And Harrington's are completely different. We don't have a Harrington's model in Australia. Harrington's was established in 1991, and they make about 20 different beers, which they sell through half a dozen shops in New Zealand, which they actually own the shops as well. And they sell a lot of their beer in 1.25 litre PET, you know, the plastic screw top, Coca-Cola type thing. So they're actually competing on price in New Zealand. It's not just competing on quality. So it's their point of difference. So two different styles of breweries, two different coloured bocks, and one's a doppel bock. So what do you think of the Three Ravens?
The Three Ravens. Well, let me just say that overall, I think this is actually an excellent style of beer. It's not as heavy as stout. It's got a bit more oomph to it than dark ale. Very palatable, very nice drink, I think. The Three Ravens in particular, I think, is very nice. It's very malty. It's got almost a hint of coffee in the aroma and taste of it. Very nicely balanced, good alcohol. Yeah, all that stuff. I think that's a 4-star beer for my
Okay. Well, I reckon it's completely true to style. Like we said before, textbook example, no hops evident on the nose, very little hop bitterness, tiny amount of hop flavour, complex malts, rich dark lager, very fine quality beer. Yeah, 3.5 stars.
Now, the Harrington's is slightly sweeter in its taste, and it's got a slightly yeastier, so a bit more of a fruity smell to it too, I think. Sort of caramel malt sort of taste to it. That's not a bad beer for me too. That's a 3-star beer for me.
I reckon it's a long way behind the Three Ravens, Robert. Where this beer falls down, it's got higher alcohol, but it lacks body, it lacks palate weight. But the nose is right with the malt, but it has too much yeast, heading towards that sort of Barocca, vitamin B, that yeast. I think that yeast component is out of balance for a style of beer that's supposed to be a lager. I find this much less attractive. I'm saying 2 stars on this one.
Okay, well, you are a hard man, Gage.